All right, next we're going to talk about the role of traditional practices, especially religious practices. Why go back to such practices in a modern age? Alain de Botton sums up the problem faced by naturalists here pretty well. He says that religions are so subtle, so complicated, so intelligent in many ways that they're not fit to be abandoned to the religious alone. In other words, what he's saying is that religions are really good at what they do. We may not agree with their explanations for how the world works, but they're really good at helping people to effect some kind of actual change in their lives. And we as naturalists can learn from that. So we learned in the last segment that daily practice integrates habits for happiness. Now, what's the next step after that? Probably the next thing is to rationally design a suite of practices that help you integrate these habits. The problem is, in my experience, when you try to do that, it ends up feeling more like Walmart than that cathedral we just saw. Why? The reason, I believe, is because when we rationally design practices deliberately, what we tend to do is appeal to the conscious system 2 mind, because we're using conscious system 2 reasoning to do it. In contrast, religions have evolved over countless generations to appeal to the whole mind, including the subconscious. The mind is much like an iceberg, where the conscious mind is just the small tip top of the mind, and then there's so much more below. Religions have evolved to appeal to that part of us, and that's why they tend to work better than when we rationally design something we think is appropriate to the modern age. Now, there's a lot of modern research in psychology on how religions do this exactly, and I've provided 3 search terms here: neurotheology, cognitive science of religion, and evolutionary psychology. So if you're interested, you can look these up on your own. But the bottom line is this: as naturalists, we need to allow ourselves to learn from religious practices that have evolved in this sense, at the same time that we endeavor to understand them naturalistically. We should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Here's a list of practices that a person could integrate into their lives. On the left are ones more traditionally associated with religion. On the right are ones that generally feel more secular, even though they may actually have a long tradition within religion. And you can feel free to work with whichever feel most appealing to you. Nevertheless, it's important that everyone at least understand how all of these practices can be powerful for naturalists, even the more traditionally religious ones. So let's concentrate on the left side. And since we don't have time to talk about all of them, let's just choose one that is particularly difficult to understand from a naturalistic perspective. Let's talk about prayer. How can prayer possibly be naturalistic? And how can it help us reform habits according to the model we're using? First, a little confession. I am a naturalistic pagan, and I practice naturalistic prayer. The image on the left here is my own altar to the goddess Isis, a goddess that comes from the Egyptian mythological tradition. And when I go before my altar, especially when I'm feeling emotionally upset, and I kneel and unload my problems to this goddess Isis, who I know full well does not exist outside my own imagination, there's a change that happens in me that is powerful. How can that be a naturalistic process? This act of prayer digs deep into our intuitive ways of thinking. Many traditionally religious practices exploit processes from the more intuitive System 1. Prayer is similar in this respect. It capitalizes on our tendency to anthropomorphize or see the human in the non-human. In this case, we take something fuzzy and abstract and hard to talk about, and we make it concrete and person-like, so that you can actually talk to that part of yourself. In essence, what it's doing is it's projecting a part of yourself onto the divine image. And since it's an image of deity, which is associated with nobility and goodness, it projects the noblest and best parts of yourself. When I pray to Isis, I talk out my current situation or problem with her as if talking with a respected mother or grandmother. And more often than not, I find the right attitude or perspective starts to just flow out of me much more easily than when I try to approach the problem abstractly. System 1 processes account for this. First, prayer is a full-bodied experience. When I pray to Isis, I kneel and I look up at the statue. And just that physical posture activates associations and processes that change my state of mind. There's a whole scientific literature on embodied cognition that studies how the way the body moves unconsciously and intuitively changes how we think. Prayer utilizes such embodied cognition. Second, prayer opens to a second perspective, that of the imagined deity. So it constitutes a kind of broadening, just as we've discussed earlier. And in this way, it can unconsciously trigger reappraisal of the situation and potentially a different emotional outcome. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, prayer engages social cognition. We are social creatures and evolved to think socially, that is, in terms of the thoughts, actions, and relationships of people. A large body of research shows we often reason better when a problem is framed in social terms. We are able to work with social problems in a more intuitive way, requiring less in terms of mental resources and producing the subjective experience of feeling like the answer has just come to you. The source is nothing supernatural, of course, but addressing the problem in a social way by talking to a mythic figure through prayer provides the right context to activate intuitive social cognition processes. Now, talking to a therapist or friend would do the same thing, so why bother to bring deity into the picture? Surely talking to a real person has its advantages, but prayer has advantages of its own. First, recall that the association of deities with nobility and goodness brings out the noblest and best parts of yourself. Second, consider that no one knows you like yourself, and so if you invoke a deity that quote-unquote knows your thoughts and your whole life situation, you don't have to describe all that context and backstory, which can be useful, especially when you're struggling with an existential situation that you can barely articulate even to yourself. Next, think about how readily we censor ourselves when talking to other people, failing to describe the real situation for fear of looking bad in their eyes. With a deity that, because it's part of your own mind, already knows all your dirty secrets, you can feel free to speak without censoring yourself. And finally, a therapist is expensive, and friends are not always available. So, frankly, prayer is cheap therapy. So, talking out a problem through prayer is not without its advantages. Now, the end result of all this is that, more often than not, I come away from prayer feeling more open and unclogged, and with a sense of burden having been lifted. Not only that, but every time I engage that noble and good perspective anthropomorphized in the divine form of Isis, I'm training my mental habits to more readily take that perspective in daily situations. So prayer also amounts to a kind of ethical character training, which has effects beyond oneself. When we automatize to the point of habit virtuous ways of seeing and responding, everyone around us benefits. And that can have ripple effects upon the world. Now, not everyone responds to prayer in the same way I do. Not at first, or sometimes not at all. To get something out of it, it takes a period of getting to know the deity through exploring their myths and symbols until you begin to feel a deep connection. And it also takes some skill to temporarily set aside the fact that you know the deity exists only in your imagination, even though, actually, we do the same thing every time we watch a movie. And finally, it may take a certain kind of personality inclined to this sort of practice in the first place. So you may or may not find prayer useful, and if not, other practices may work better for you. But the point here is for everyone to understand that even the most traditionally religious practices, like prayer, can be naturalistic and can be life-enriching for naturalists. So to sum up, we should not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Traditionally religious practices often work better than rationally designed practices, in part because they've evolved by cultural evolution to appeal to the whole mind, not just the conscious mind. Just because a practice seems wedded to the supernatural is no reason to dismiss it out of hand. A naturalistic perspective can almost always be found by looking at the underlying psychological processes, and this may unlock a whole realm of experience that can enhance your life. So, as Alain de Botton says, religion is not fit to be abandoned to the religious alone. We, as naturalists, can learn from and embrace the full legacy of our cultural heritage.